You're watching the History Fella channel. In this video we're looking at the Siege of Corinth. The Siege of Corinth was an American Civil War engagement lasting from April the 29th to May the 30th of 1862 in Corinth, Mississippi. A collection of Union forces under the overall command of Major General Henry Halleck engaged in a month-long siege of the city, whose Confederate occupants were commanded by General P.G.T. Beauregard. The siege resulted in the capture of the town by Federal forces. The town was a strategic point at the junction of two vital railroad lines, the Mobile and the Ohio Railroad, and the Memphis and Charleston Railroad. Former Confederate Secretary of War Leroy Pope Walker called this intersection the vertebrae of the Confederacy. Halleck argued Richmond and Corinth are now the great strategic points of the war, and our success at these points should be ensured at all hazards. Another reason for the town's importance was that, if captured by Union forces, it would threaten the security of Chattanooga, Tennessee, and render Southern control of the track west of that East Tennessee bastion meaningless. The siege ended when the outnumbered Confederates withdrew on May the 29th. This effectively cut off the prospect of further Confederate attempts to regain western Tennessee. The Union forces under Ulysses S. Grant took control and made it the base for Grant's operations to seize control of the Mississippi River Valley, and especially the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg, Mississippi. Grant later recalled in his memoirs the importance Corinth held in the cause of a Union victory in the region. Corinth was a valuable strategic point for the enemy to hold, and consequently a valuable one for us to possess ourselves of. General C.S. Hamilton later recounted that the importance of Corinth was summed up as such. The Confederate armies had been driven from the Ohio River, almost out of the states of Tennessee and Kentucky, steadying back for a distance of 200 miles. Federal occupation reaching the Gulf states, where chivalrous foes had been sure Yankee would never set foot. Sherman, too, later wrote of the importance of Corinth, held after the Second Battle of Corinth was concluded. In Memphis, I could see its effects upon the citizens, and they openly admitted that their cause had sustained a death blow. With the siege of Corinth completed, Federal troops had the opportunity to strike towards Vicksburg or Chattanooga, but it was after the Second Battle of Corinth, that October, that Grant struck for Vicksburg. The siege of Corinth was described by Major General Sherman as a change in the tactics in western Tennessee. The effect of the Battle of Corinth was very great. It was indeed a decisive blow to the Confederate cause in our quarter, and changed the whole aspect of affairs in West Tennessee. From the timid defensive, we were at once enabled to assume the bold offensive. Following the Union Army victory at the Battle of Shiloh on April the 6th and 7th, Major General Henry Halleck amassed three Union armies: the Army of the Tennessee, the Army of the Ohio, and the Army of the Mississippi, for an advance on the vital rail center of Corinth, Mississippi. More cautious, by the staggering losses at Shiloh, Halleck embarked on a tedious campaign of offensive entrenchment, fortifying at each advance. By May the 25th, 1862, after moving 5 miles in 3 weeks, Halleck was in position to lay siege to the town. Confederate morale was low, and Beauregard was outnumbered 2-1. The water was bad. Typhoid and dysentery had felled thousands of his men. At the Council of War, the Confederate officers concluded that they could not hold the railroad crossover. Sickness had claimed the lives of lives of as many men as the Confederacy had lost at Shiloh. The Federal Division under Stanley moved south down to the road at Corinth to search for the enemy. On April 29, 1862, Brigadier General Elliott, with 16 companies of cavalry, including the 2nd Iowa Cavalry Regiment and part of the 2nd Michigan Cavalry Regiment, made contact with Confederate pickets of Forrest's 3rd Tennessee, who retreated rapidly, leaving some infantry of Patton Anderson's brigade in camp unprepared. The 2nd Iowa captured 11 men in its dash. Then 2nd Iowa entered Monterey and captured more of the enemy. The 2nd Iowa continued until it came to the bridge opposed by Washington's Louisiana Battery and Colonel Kelly's men of the 3rd Tennessee Regiment. The 2nd Iowa charged into canister fire and lost 1 killed and 3 wounded. The 2nd Iowa retired some distance away. Kelly reported 1 or 2 of his men killed and no mention of captured. Of Halleck's wing commanders, Pope proved to be the most aggressive during the campaign. Pope led the army's left wing and was furthest away from Halleck's headquarters. On May the 3rd, Pope moved forward and captured the town of Farmington, only a few miles from Corinth. Instead of moving to the center wing under Buell forward, Halleck ordered Pope to withdraw and realign with Buell. Beauregard ordered Van Dorn to attack Pope's advanced wing on May the 9th. Pope made a successful withdrawal and rejoined with Buell. Bragg, who also participated in the attack, had 25,000 men. The Union Army had 12,000 troops on hand. Van Dorn's corps, barely engaged, had 9 casualties. Daniel Ruggles' division of Bragg's corps, on the other hand, which bore the brunt of the fighting, suffered casualties of 8 dead, 89 wounded, and 2 missing or captured. The Union Army had 16 killed, 148 wounded, and 14 missing or captured. The 8th Wisconsin Volunteer Infantry Regiment was ordered to draw the enemy out, as to count their numbers, and they withdrew to a swamp north of town. Wisconsin 8th reported 5 killed, 14 severely wounded, and 19 slightly wounded. The Eagle, Old Abe, accompanied the Wisconsin 8th Infantry. The 5th Minnesota Infantry Regiment arrived in Corinth on May the 24th and reported to Pope in the field before Corinth, Mississippi, and was assigned to the 2nd Brigade, 1st Division, Army of the Mississippi. The regiment had hardly time to establish its camp and realize its surroundings before it was brought into action. On the 28th of May, 4 days after it reached the front, it participated in the tail end of the Battle of Farmington, contributing a number of killed and wounded. As the wings of Halleck's army group began to align themselves in front of Corinth, Major General William Tecumseh Sherman proposed a battle of attack against the Confederate brigade of Brigadier General James R. Chambers, which had created a strong defensive position at the Russell House along the Confederate front lines. Sherman met with Generals Halleck and Thomas on May the 16th to discuss his plan. Sherman planned for the brigades of Colonel Morgan L. Smith and Brigadier General James W. Denver to lead the attack, with Brigadier General Stephen A. Hulbert, his division, lending support. On May the 17th, the attack commenced with Denver on the right, Smith in the centre, and Hulbert's reserve to the right. Chalmers offered a stubborn resistance, with some of his men fired from within the Russell House. The Confederates also succeeded with a flank attack against Smith's right, but was repulsed by Colonel Thomas Kilby Smith and the 54th Ohio Infantry, As soon as a battery from the 1st Illinois Artillery deployed, the advantage was in favor of the Union forces. Chalmers retreated beyond Phillips Creek near the Russell House property, and Morgan Smith's brigade occupied high ground on which the house stood. Sherman's losses were 10 killed and 31 wounded, all of which were Smith's brigade. Confederate losses were unknown, but Sherman reported 12 dead left on the field. That same day, a division under Brigadier General Thomas W. Sherman drove off a Confederate force covering a crossing along Bridge Creek. On May the 21st, Major General William Bull Nelson ordered Colonel Thomas D. Sedgwick to conduct the reconnaissance in force against the Confederate trenches along Bridge Creek near Widow Surratt's farm. Sedgwick moved forward from the Union trenches occupied by Brigadier General Thomas J. Wood's division and deployed the 20th Kentucky Infantry at the edge of a clearing and the 1st Kentucky Infantry to the left, facing a densely wooded area. Shortly after deployment, the Kentuckians came under fire. The Confederate resistance was so severe, Sedgwick was forced to fall back. Sedgwick brought forward artillery and the 2nd Kentucky Infantry, while Wood lent cavalry support from his division. The Confederates attempted a flank attack against the 1st Kentucky, but the Union artillery and the 31st Indiana Infantry in reserve stabilized the line. The Confederates made 3 more attempts to turn the Union flank until retiring to a creek beyond the Surratt farm. Nelson ordered Sedgwick to hold his position until nightfall, then return to the Union camp. A week later, Buell mounted an attack to gain the high ground surrounding the Surratt farm. On May the 27th, Halleck ordered Sherman to drive the Confederates from a log house along the Corinth road and make a strong demonstration against Corinth itself if possible. At the edge of a cotton field along Sherman's front was a double log house, which the Confederates had converted into a blockhouse by removing the chinking between the logs. Sherman formed an attacking column with Morgan L. Smith's brigade on the left and James W. Denver's brigade on the right. John A. Logan's brigade and James C. Veitch's brigade were also brought up in support. Colonel Ezra Taylor fired several artillery rounds to signal the infantry attack. Denver and Smith quickly overtook the log house by storm and secured the hilltop position. The Confederates rallied and drove in Sherman's skirmishers, but the counterattack was repulsed by the main line of infantry with artillery support. The following day, the rest of Sherman's division and artillery moved forward to the new position, which offered a good vantage point into Corinth itself. Grant and Thomas were both present on the field during this engagement, giving approval for the behavior of the operation. Confederate infantry had been using a hill in the vicinity of the Widow Surratt farm for picket outposts. With all his wings in line, Halleck ordered Buell to clear the Confederates off the Surratt farm hill. Buell chose Major General Alexander M. McCook's reserve division to seize the hill to be used as a staging point for a further attack against Corinth. On May the 27th, McCook organized his brigades into a line of attack, intending to overwhelm the Confederates by surprise and overwhelming force. The brigades of Brigadier General Lovell H. Russo and Brigadier General Richard W. Johnson led the advance, side by side. Colonel Frederick S. Stumbaugh's brigade followed in support of Johnson and Colonel Robert L. McCook's brigade in support of Russo. Johnson's brigade encountered some heavy skirmishing, but the hill was taken in short time. McCook's division entrenched and brought heavily artillery to the new position and immediately began to shell the Confederates. Beauregard's artillery responded with minimal effort. The engagement at Surratt Farm Hill allowed Halleck to bring forward siege guns for the bombardment of Corinth. On May the 28th, Nelson ordered Sedgwick to seize a Confederate-held crossing of Bridge Creek, a small tributary of the Tuscumbia River. Sedgwick moved his brigade out from the main Union trenches with the 2nd and 20th Kentucky in the lead. Sedgwick drove in the Confederate pickets, then encountered a larger force guarding the bridge. The Kentucky infantry managed to gain hold of the eastern end of the bridge, while Sedgwick ordered forward the 31st Indiana Infantry and Captain John Mendenhall's artillery battery. These reinforcements and artillery forced the Confederates to abandon the bridge completely. With the Federal Army preparing to lay siege to the town, the Confederate Council of War decided to retreat. Beauregard saved his army by a hoax. Some of the men were given 3 days' rations in order to prepare for an attack. As expected, 1 or 2 went over to the Union with that news. The preliminary bombardment began and Union forces maneuvered for position. During the night of May the 29th, the Confederate Army moved out. They used the Mobile and Ohio Railroad to carry the sick and wounded, the heavy artillery, and tons of supplies. When the train arrived, the troops cheered as though reinforcements were arriving. They set up dummy Quaker guns along the defensive earthworks. Campfires were kept burning, and buglers and drummers played. The rest of the men slipped away undetected, withdrawing to Tupelo, Mississippi. When Union patrols entered Corinth on the morning of May the 30th, they found the Confederate troops were gone. The Union forces took control and made it the base for their operations to seize control of the Mississippi River Valley, and especially the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg, Mississippi. Pope, whose aggressiveness exceeded his strategic capabilities, remarked in his memoirs that Halleck's cautious campaign failed to take full advantage of a glittering array of talented Union officers, including Grant, W.T. Sherman, Sheridan, Thomas, McPherson, Logan, Buell, Rosecrans, and many others I might mention. The Confederate Army led by Van Dorn attempted to retake the city in October 1862, but was defeated in the Second Battle of Corinth by a Union army under the command of Rosecrans. At times during the second battle, Confederate forces seemed to have the upper hand, but failed to follow up on their successes, leading to a devastating defeat for Confederate forces in that region. Rosecrans had the opportunity to crush rebel forces during the battle, but failed to follow up his victory, allowing Van Dorn to escape from destruction. Corinth ultimately led to operations that opened the Mississippi River Valley, which were considered by Halleck as the opening of the Mississippi River will be to us of more advantage than the capture of 40 Richmonds. If you found the information in this video informative or helpful, please feel free to give the video a thumbs up. Other than that, thank you very much for watching and listening to this video.